This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. In a small town in Ohio, tucked between the rolling green hills and the narrow, winding streets, Lily's family occupied a modest, two-story house. The exterior was plain but neatly kept an arrangement of stone steps leading up to the front porch, two pots of wilted flowers her father always intended to replace, and a modest garden that was mostly weeds. Everything about it seemed to strive for normalcy, just like every other house on the street, yet for Lily the house had begun to feel oppressive, almost haunted by an unsettling sense of change she couldn't ignore. Lily's father, David, was a practical man. He worked long hours as a mechanic at a local garage and rarely spoke about his feelings. Since her mother's passing years ago, he had been a quiet but sturdy presence in her life, a man who managed to hold things together through routine, taking pride in his ability to face each day with a stoic sense of purpose. His few words and rare shows of affection were the constants in Lily's life, markers of stability in a world that had shifted too soon and too unexpectedly for a young girl. But recently his routine had changed in subtle ways, ways that made Lily feel as though she were no longer entirely certain of the man she had known. That change, she knew, was because of Emma. Emma had appeared suddenly, it seemed, slipping into their lives in the kind of quiet way that catches you only in hindsight. Lily tried to remember the first time she'd seen her, a woman with soft eyes, long brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail, and a smile that seemed just a bit too perfect, like she'd practiced it. Emma had brought warmth into the house, an unfamiliar energy that Lily wasn't sure how to place. There was something calm and collected about her that made her seem distant, as though she existed in her own world, only intersecting with Lily's when absolutely necessary. Yet Emma wasn't exactly a warm person. She was polite, always careful, perhaps a little too careful in the way she carried herself around Lily, as though trying to avoid saying or doing anything that might disturb the delicate balance of their household. She had a way of moving around the house that was nearly soundless, a subtlety that Lily had initially found fascinating. But over time it grew into an irritation, as though Emma were erasing herself or hiding parts of who she was from view, folding herself into a quiet, respectful figure, almost ghost-like. In the few months since Emma had married her father, Lily had noticed other changes in her home. The usual stillness that had once felt comforting now seemed uneasy, punctuated by long, awkward silences. Emma's presence made Lily feel as though an invisible line had been drawn down the middle of the house. On one side was the life she had known, simple, quiet, familiar. On the other was this new, uncertain presence of a woman who seemed to live behind a wall of secrets, secrets that Lily could almost feel pulsing beneath the surface, calling out to be uncovered. Lily often found herself studying Emma's movements, the way her hands seemed to linger a second too long when setting down a dish or adjusting a picture frame. Emma's subtle hesitations and fleeting expressions made Lily think of the polished surface of a lake hiding unfathomable depths. She sensed that Emma was protecting something, perhaps an entire life that had been concealed from view. But why? That question lodged itself deep in her mind, a tiny seed of suspicion that, as time went on, took root and grew, twisting around her thoughts and influencing how she saw everything Emma did. The house became a theater of quiet observation, of glances and assumptions, an endless loop of watching and being watched. Lily grew more attuned to details she had never noticed before. Emma's choice of clothes, always understated and plain, as if she were trying to avoid attention. The way her father's voice softened around her, so different from his usual tone, as though she were something fragile he feared might break. Lily saw the way Emma avoided the neighbors, how she seemed to disappear at social gatherings, staying just long enough to avoid seeming rude before retreating to the house, where she often spent hours alone, reading in the dim light of her room. And then there was the way Emma looked at her father. There was tenderness in her gaze, yes, but also a layer of something Lily could not define, something that made her uncomfortable. It was a look that seemed heavy with history, with memories she knew nothing about, and it stirred an unfamiliar jealousy in her, a feeling she couldn't shake. She wanted to know what Emma was hiding, why she seemed so intent on creating an image that felt so fragile, so carefully constructed. In Emma's presence, she felt herself becoming someone else, someone more suspicious, more observant, as though a darker side of herself were emerging in response to Emma's concealed past. Lily found herself wandering around the house late at night, tiptoeing through the shadows, scanning Emma's belongings for clues, for anything that might shed light on the mystery Emma presented. She opened drawers, glanced at family photos, and examined documents when she thought no one was looking, piecing together fragments of a story she didn't yet understand. This secretive search for answers became her obsession, a ritual that replaced the routines she had once followed with her father. Emma's past became a labyrinth in her mind, twisting and turning with possibilities that ranged from the fantastical to the darkly plausible. And in the quiet spaces of her own mind, Lily felt an uncomfortable transformation taking place. She was no longer the quiet girl who missed her mother and looked up to her father with innocent, unspoken admiration. She was becoming someone new, someone darker, someone who could no longer see Emma as just her father's wife. Emma was an enigma, a puzzle with pieces scattered across the house, across the fragile veneer of her family's life, and Lily felt compelled to solve it, no matter the cost. In those late hours, surrounded by shadows and unanswered questions, Lily felt both powerful and powerless. The mystery had given her a sense of control over the fragile world around her, a feeling that she held the key to unraveling the life Emma had tried so hard to build. And yet that feeling also brought with it a deep, chilling loneliness, as though she were descending into a world where she could no longer trust anyone, not even herself. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a place of buried secrets and unanswered questions, a place where every room seemed to harbor a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. And in the center of it all was Lily, a girl driven by her own obsession, unable to let go of the feeling that her family was slipping away from her, piece by piece, under the weight of a hidden truth she felt she was meant to discover. Lily's curiosity had grown into something far more powerful, a relentless, gnawing urge to peel back the layers of secrecy she sensed around her stepmother Emma. What had started as idle wonder now had her moving through the house as though on a mission, her eyes and mind constantly alert for clues, as if her own life and her own identity depended on uncovering the truth about Emma. She couldn't explain it, but there was something about Emma's guarded manner that planted seeds of suspicion in her, pushing her toward answers she both craved and feared. One afternoon, when her father was out working and the house was quiet, Lily's gaze settled on her parents' bedroom door. She stood there for a moment, feeling an urge she couldn't quite name. It was as if something inside that room called to her, beckoning her to cross the threshold. Her fingers grazed the doorknob, a faint tremor passing through her as she felt the cold metal in her hand, realizing that crossing this boundary would be an act she couldn't undo. But her curiosity had grown too strong. The mysteries that Emma held seemed almost to pulse with their own power, and Lily felt as though these mysteries were consuming her, begging her to dive deeper. Stepping inside, the room felt alien, unfamiliar, despite the fact that it belonged to her family. Emma's things were tucked away neatly on one side of the room, orderly and controlled, much like Emma herself. Lily's eyes drifted to the closet, the dresser, the small wooden box on the nightstand. She knew she was trespassing in a space meant to be private, yet she felt that same, undeniable pull toward the concealed corners where secrets might lie hidden. It was as if the room itself had been waiting for her to come in and unlock its silent, unspoken stories. Her search started slowly, almost reverently, her hands gliding over the delicate objects on Emma's nightstand, then moving to her closet. She sifted through soft sweaters, crisp blouses, and warm coats, finding nothing unusual in the items themselves, but noticing something about their selection. Each piece was carefully chosen, with nothing out of place and nothing to hint at a previous life. Lily's fingers brushed past a silk scarf and trailed along the edges of shoes neatly aligned in pairs, her mind absorbing each item as part of the puzzle she was piecing together. But it wasn't until she opened a drawer in the nightstand that she found the thing that would change everything. Beneath a few stray notebooks and a handful of old postcards was an envelope, thick and worn, containing a small bundle of papers, some yellowed with age. Lily hesitated, feeling her heartbeat quicken as she realized that she was holding something truly private, something Emma had taken pains to hide. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on her shoulders as she finally drew out the papers and unfolded them, her eyes scanning the words before her. At first, she didn't fully comprehend what she was seeing. The pages were filled with official-looking text, legal terms she couldn't completely understand. Then her gaze fell upon a name she didn't recognize and a set of documents that, pieced together, told a story she could hardly believe. They were official records, medical reports, certificates of identity, things she hadn't even realized existed. And as she began to understand the words in front of her, Lily felt a strange, unsettling chill creep up her spine. These documents told a story of a transformation, one that had taken place long before Emma had entered her life. She read the details again, barely daring to believe what they implied. The person in these records was Emma, and yet, she was not the Emma Lily thought she knew. These documents traced a journey that had shaped Emma's very identity. Emma had once been someone else, someone living under a different name and a different gender, someone who had gone through tremendous change in order to become the woman Lily knew today. The implications swept over her like a flood, each realization hitting her harder than the last. The woman who had entered her home, her life, and her father's heart had been carrying a secret of unfathomable depth. A secret, Lily thought, that had been quietly hidden in the very walls of their home, right under her nose. She felt a dizzying mixture of confusion, betrayal, and anger as the weight of this truth sank in, filling her with emotions too complex to name. At first, Lily felt a surge of betrayal, a feeling as though she had been lied to, as if her home and her family had been built on a foundation of deception. Emma had walked into their lives with the past cloaked in shadows, and now those shadows stretched out to touch every corner of Lily's world. She felt an urge to tear the papers apart, to erase the knowledge from her mind, yet she couldn't. The truth had carved itself into her consciousness, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake it loose. The next wave of feeling was something darker, something unsettlingly cold. As she stared at the papers in her hands, Lily began to feel her own anger twisting inside her, knotting itself around her heart. She tried to make sense of the emotions coursing through her, to understand what it meant for Emma to have lived this other life, this hidden life, and yet still present herself as if nothing had happened, as if the person she once was didn't exist. To Lily, it felt like a lie of staggering proportions, a lie that infected her sense of what was real and what was false in her family. What did this make Emma? She wondered, her mind grasping for answers that felt out of reach. The woman who had come into their home, who had gently laid her hand on her father's shoulder in a gesture of comfort, who had set the table with soft smiles and quiet gestures of kindness, was she even real? Or was she a stranger, a foreigner who had infiltrated their lives under false pretenses? The questions churned inside her, filling her with a sense of unease she could not contain. And in that moment, Lily felt something else, an almost irresistible urge to take action, to do something that would shake Emma from the pedestal she had so carefully constructed, to tear down the facade and reveal her stepmother for who she truly was. She felt as though Emma's very presence was a kind of invasion, a silent trespass that had happened right under her nose, unseen until now. She was filled with a need to confront, to uncover, to force Emma to face the reality of what her secrecy had done to their family. As she sat there, the papers spread before her, Lily felt as though her own innocence had been shattered in the process. She had crossed an invisible line, moved beyond the realm of childish curiosity into something far darker and more dangerous. Her mind was no longer that of a simple girl seeking answers, it was the mind of someone who felt as though she had been deceived, her world altered by a revelation that had the power to change everything. The room seemed to darken around her, as if the air had grown heavier under the weight of the discovery. She felt as though she was no longer just a girl with a secret, but rather the keeper of something profound, something terrible. The life Emma had left behind was now part of her family, entwined with their existence in a way she could neither erase nor ignore. And in that tangled web of feelings, she felt a seed of resentment begin to grow, a resentment that would eventually drive her toward an irreversible choice. In those moments, alone with her discovery, Lily felt the borders of her world shift and change. She no longer saw Emma as the calm, collected woman who had quietly integrated herself into their lives. She saw her as a figure cloaked in deception, a stranger who had breached the very sanctity of their home. And as Lily's mind turned over these thoughts, a single, undeniable conviction took root within her, one that would lead her down a path from which there could be no return. The days that followed Lily's discovery blurred together in a haze of silent tension. Each morning, she woke up feeling as though her skin were stretched too tight, every nerve inside her attuned to Emma's presence in the house. She moved around her stepmother like a shadow, her eyes watchful, her emotions stewing just beneath the surface. With every passing moment, the weight of the secret she carried grew heavier, coiling tighter around her heart. The resentment she felt was like a fire licking at her insides, consuming her with a need to break through the lies, to confront the betrayal Emma had woven so silently into their lives. For Lily, the sense of betrayal was an abyss that had no bottom. It had swallowed up every sense of security she'd once felt, transforming the home that had once been her sanctuary into a prison of confusion and distrust. Emma moved about the house in her usual way, her gestures as calm as ever, her smiles as gentle, but to Lily, everything about her felt false now. Each polite glance, each small kindness that Emma extended seemed to mock her, as if Emma were daring Lily to question her, to shatter the peace she'd worked so hard to maintain. Every time she saw Emma's face, Lily felt a surge of anger bubbling up within her, an anger that was no longer simply about the secret Emma had kept. It was about the audacity of her silence, her refusal to acknowledge what Lily had uncovered. How could Emma walk through the house each day, carrying on as if nothing were wrong, as if she hadn't kept hidden a part of herself so fundamental? Lily could feel the betrayal lodged within her chest like a stone, a dark weight pressing down on her spirit, urging her to act, to break the fragile surface of their lives and force the truth into the open. Finally, the tension reached a breaking point. One evening, Lily found herself drawn to Emma's presence as if by an invisible force, unable to resist the compulsion any longer. Emma was sitting in the living room, her face softened by the dim light of a single lamp, lost in her own thoughts. To anyone else, she might have appeared serene, even content, but to Lily, that image was nothing more than a mask, a careful construction hiding the life she had left behind. Lily's pulse hammered in her ears, her emotions roiling like a storm inside her, her fists clenched at her sides. As she looked at Emma, her mind raced with memories of the documents she'd uncovered, the evidence of the hidden life that Emma had kept locked away. In that moment, the silence between them felt unbearable, like a gulf that separated not only their bodies but their very souls. The air was thick, charged with the weight of things unsaid, and the room felt stifling, as if it could barely contain the tension swirling within it. Lily stepped closer, her gaze hard, her face taut with the weight of her feelings. Emma glanced up, sensing the shift in the room, her expression one of quiet surprise tinged with apprehension. There was something in Emma's eyes that seemed almost pleading, as though she could feel the enormity of what was coming, yet was powerless to stop it. Her calm demeanor was a fragile shield against the storm brewing in Lily's heart, and Lily saw in her expression a trace of guilt, or perhaps it was fear or recognition that the secret she had tried so hard to bury had finally risen to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. In that silent exchange of glances, so much was conveyed between them. Emma's eyes reflected an entire history, a past that was riddled with pain, rejection, and resilience, a life lived in quiet survival, one that had shaped her into the person she was today. But to Lily, that resilience seemed almost like an affront, a stubborn insistence on clinging to a truth that had no place in the life they shared. She felt as though Emma's very presence were a violation of the family she had once cherished, a dark intrusion into her memories of her father's love and loyalty. The anger inside her intensified, transforming from a simmering resentment into a full-fledged rage. She wanted to shatter the calm mask Emma wore, to force her to see the damage she'd caused simply by existing in their home with a secret so profound. Her vision narrowed, focusing entirely on Emma, the woman who had dared to build a life upon a lie, who had dared to enter Lily's world with a past she had no right to hide. The feelings swelled within her, choking her, demanding release, and she felt herself being pulled toward a place of darkness she had never known before. In a single, swift movement, Lily crossed the room, the space between them disappearing in an instant. She felt the weight of her fury pressing down on her, clouding her judgment, propelling her forward with a force that was beyond her control. Her heart was pounding, her breathing shallow, and in that moment it was as if every emotion she had bottled up inside her erupted like a volcano. She could feel the intensity of her anger manifesting physically, in the way her hands clenched, her jaw tightened, and her eyes bore into Emma with an intensity that was almost feral. Emma's gaze remained steady, unwavering, as if she were bracing herself for what was coming, as if she had already accepted the inevitability of this moment. There was a strange sadness in her eyes, a deep sorrow that seemed to acknowledge the pain she had caused, even if she hadn't intended it. But to Lily, that sorrow felt hollow, insufficient, a pitiful response to the betrayal she had inflicted on their family. In that moment, Lily felt an urge so strong it was almost overwhelming to break through Emma's composed exterior, to force her to feel the full impact of her deception. Without fully understanding what she was doing, Lily reached out, her hands trembling with the force of her emotions. Her mind swirled with images, her father's quiet strength, her mother's memory, the peaceful life she had once known, all of it tainted now by Emma's hidden truth. She wanted to reclaim that life, to erase the shadows Emma had cast over it, to make her pay for the pain she had caused simply by existing in a way that defied Lily's understanding. And in that split second, as her anger reached its peak, she felt herself cross a line she could never return from. Her movements were fueled not by reason, but by a raw, primal need to make Emma see the consequences of her choices. The air seemed to crackle with an energy that was both terrifying and exhilarating, a sense of power that surged through her, leaving her breathless, her body tense with the anticipation of release. In that final, fateful moment, Lily felt a strange calm settle over her, a chilling certainty that what she was doing was justified, that Emma's betrayal had to be met with a response that was as irreversible as the hurt she had caused. And as she felt the impact of her actions reverberate through the room, she knew that the family she had once cherished was gone, that the life she had known could never be recovered. She had taken the truth into her own hands, twisted it, and in doing so she had irrevocably shattered the fragile world they had all inhabited. The silence that followed was profound, an echoing void that seemed to swallow every sound, every thought. The room felt empty, hollow, as if it were holding its breath, absorbing the weight of what had just transpired. And in that silence, Lily felt the full impact of what she had done settle over her, filling her with a numbness that was both foreign and strangely comforting. She had crossed the threshold from innocence to something darker, something irrevocable, and there was no going back. The confrontation had been brief, intense, and final, a collision of truths and lies, of hidden pasts and unrelenting anger. And as Lily stood there, surrounded by the aftermath of her actions, she felt as though she were suspended between two worlds, one filled with the broken remains of her family's life, and the other, an uncertain future where she would have to reckon with the choices she had made. In that darkened room, beneath the weight of the truth she had uncovered, Lily felt the gravity of her actions settle into her bones, marking her forever. The life she had once known was gone, transformed into something unrecognizable, leaving her standing in the quiet wreckage of her own making. In the dimness of that evening, the air seemed heavy and alive, charged with a sense of inevitability. Every shadow loomed larger, every silence more oppressive. Lily felt as though she were being drawn deeper into a place she did not recognize, a realm of dark thoughts and unspoken intentions, of emotions too intense to fully comprehend. The confrontation had brought her to the brink, pushing her into a space where her anger was no longer something contained, but a force that had taken on a life of its own, propelling her forward into actions she could barely control. As she stood in front of Emma, she could feel her heartbeat pounding in her temples, her entire body taut with a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. It was as if, in that moment, everything she had ever felt, every hurt, every betrayal, every doubt had converged into a singular, unstoppable wave. Her anger was a flame, consuming her rationality, blinding her to the person she had once been. She felt both empowered and lost, her sense of self slipping away as the fury within her grew, raw and unchecked. Emma's face, pale in the dim light, bore an expression of fear mixed with a deep sorrow, as if she understood exactly what was happening, understood the darkness that had overtaken Lily. Yet her calmness was almost infuriating to Lily, as if Emma were too composed, too accepting of this consequence. The stillness of Emma's response only stoked the flames in Lily, driving her to break through the last barrier of restraint she had left. In that split second, everything unfolded with terrifying clarity, and yet it felt surreal, as if time itself had slowed, trapping them both in a moment that seemed to expand endlessly. Lily's hands moved almost of their own accord, driven by a compulsion she could neither understand nor resist. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy glass paperweight from the shelf beside her, and felt its cold solidity press against her skin, grounding her even as it propelled her toward a decision she hadn't consciously made. She felt the weight of it in her hand, a physical manifestation of her anger and pain, and for a fleeting moment she felt a sickening sense of power course through her. The power to break, to destroy, to exact some twisted form of justice. Yet beneath that power, beneath that rush of adrenaline, there was something darker still, an emptiness, a hollow recognition that this act would sever something fundamental within her, something she could never retrieve. Lily barely recognized herself as she lifted the paperweight, her hands trembling from the raw intensity of her emotions. In those final seconds, her mind raced through a series of images: her father's gentle smile, the warmth of her mother's embrace, the sense of safety she had once known. All of it felt distant now, as though her former life had been nothing more than a fragile illusion. She knew, somewhere deep within herself, that once she crossed this line, there would be no return. And yet that realization only fueled her further, compelling her to press forward, as if she were driven by something beyond her own will. The moment of impact was both shocking and strangely silent, as though the air itself had been struck dumb, unable to register what had just occurred. Lily felt the vibration of it travel up her arm, the force reverberating through her body, and in that instant she felt a terrible clarity settle over her, a realization of what she had done, a shuddering awareness that left her feeling both exhilarated and horrified. Emma stumbled backward, her expression one of pure shock, a look that seemed to linger in the dim light, imprinted upon Lily's mind with a vividness that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In the aftermath, the silence was deafening, a thick, suffocating quiet that wrapped itself around Lily like a shroud. She could see Emma struggling to regain her balance, her movements slow, almost dreamlike, as if she were caught between two worlds. There was no sound, only the relentless pounding of Lily's own heartbeat, loud and insistent, a brutal reminder of the life she had just irrevocably altered. As Emma collapsed, her body folding into itself with a slow, terrible grace, Lily felt a strange mixture of emotions flood through her. Relief, shame, regret, and a deep, searing guilt that seemed to carve itself into her very soul. She wanted to undo it, to rewind time and erase the violence that had just erupted, but she knew that no such relief would come. She was trapped in the moment, forced to bear witness to the consequences of her own actions, unable to escape the weight of what she had done. Lily felt herself sinking to the floor, her knees giving way beneath her, as the reality of the situation settled over her like a heavy, unmovable fog. She could barely look at Emma, could barely acknowledge the enormity of the act she had just committed. Her hands, still trembling, felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else, someone darker and more twisted than the girl she had once been. She couldn't reconcile the violence she had unleashed with the quiet life she had once known, with the girl she had been before this discovery had shattered her world. As she sat there, staring at her stepmother's still form, Lily felt the room close in around her, the walls pressing in, the air thick and suffocating. The weight of her guilt was suffocating, an unrelenting force that left her gasping for breath, searching for a way to escape the horror she had wrought. She wanted to scream, to cry, to release the emotions that churned within her, but no sound would come. She was trapped in her own silence, her own anguish, a prisoner of her own actions. The enormity of what she had done filled her mind, clouding her thoughts, rendering her unable to comprehend the consequences that would follow. All she knew was that her life, her family, her sense of self, all of it was fractured beyond repair. She felt herself slipping away, drifting into a place where the world around her felt dim and distant, a world that was no longer hers to inhabit. In that darkened room, with the weight of her actions pressing down upon her, Lily felt the finality of her choice settle into her bones. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, severing herself from the life she had once known, from the person she had once been. And in that terrible stillness, she understood that the darkness within her had not come from Emma's secret, or even from her betrayal. It had come from her own heart, from the depths of her own unresolved pain, manifesting in a moment of rage that would haunt her for the rest of her days. The struggle, brief and fierce, had left a scar that would never heal. Lily was no longer an innocent girl searching for answers. She was someone else now, someone marked by violence, by regret, by a darkness that would shadow her forever. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a place of ruin, a testament to the destruction that her own hands had wrought. And as she sat there, alone in the suffocating quiet, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. In the days that followed, the house grew silent and stale, a hollow echo of the life that had once pulsed within its walls. The emptiness permeated every room, filling the air with a dense, suffocating quiet, as if the house itself were holding its breath, trying to comprehend the enormity of what had occurred. The sunlight, once warm and gentle, now seemed cold and intrusive, spilling through the windows like an unwelcome guest, illuminating the broken remains of a family in ruin. The police arrived with their questions, with their quiet, scrutinizing stares, and with the careful, impersonal steps of people accustomed to confronting horror. They moved through the house like surgeons, picking apart the fabric of Lily's life, stripping it down to bare facts, to evidence. Everything they touched seemed to tarnish with their presence, as if they carried with them a darkness that matched the one lurking within Lily's heart. They did not know her secret, the force of her rage, or the depth of her regret, but their gaze seemed to pierce through her, as if sensing the shadows that clung to her, refusing to let go. Each room was combed over, each surface dusted for prints, each item scrutinized for its relevance to the terrible act that had left the family fractured beyond repair. The home that had once felt so familiar was now a place of exposure, stripped of its warmth, its secrets laid bare for strangers to examine. Lily could hear the hushed conversations between officers, could see the way they looked at her father with a mix of pity and suspicion, as if they wondered how much he had known, how much he might have suspected about the turmoil that had unfolded beneath his own roof. Lily's father was a hollow shell of the man he had once been. His face, worn and grief-stricken, seemed to age with every passing hour. He moved through the house in a daze, as though trying to awaken from a nightmare that refused to release him. She saw the weight of his sorrow in the slump of his shoulders, in the vacant look in his eyes, in the trembling hands that reached out, again and again, for something, anything that might offer him solace. But there was no comfort to be found in the walls that had witnessed such violence. There was only silence, and the unbearable knowledge that his world had been forever shattered by a truth he could never have anticipated. The townspeople soon caught wind of the tragedy, and the story spread like wildfire, carried by whispers and quiet conversations, by hushed glances and sympathetic nods. The community was quick to speculate, to weave together fragments of gossip and rumor, trying to piece together the narrative of a family that had seemed so ordinary, so unremarkable, until the moment it wasn't. They spoke of Emma in tones of pity and disdain, of Lily with shock and confusion, unable to reconcile the image of a young girl with the dark, unthinkable actions that had torn her family apart. To them, she was a stranger, an enigma, someone who had crossed a line they could neither understand nor forgive. In the weeks that followed, the investigation cast a long, unrelenting shadow over Lily's life. Detectives delved into every corner of her existence, pulling apart the fabric of her family's life with a precision that felt both brutal and necessary. They asked questions she could barely bring herself to answer, their words laced with an implication she could sense, even if they never voiced it outright. They wanted to understand her motivations, her thoughts, the feelings that had driven her to that fateful moment. And yet, how could she explain something so vast, so complex, so twisted in its sorrow and rage, to people who could never truly understand the depths of her despair? For Lily, each question, each probing look, felt like a mirror held up to her own guilt, a reflection of the darkness she could no longer escape. She had become a stranger to herself, haunted by the weight of her actions, by the knowledge that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. Her mind drifted back to that terrible moment, replaying it over and over, each memory sharper than the last, each detail a reminder of the horror she had unleashed upon her own life. She could feel the emptiness growing within her, an abyss that threatened to consume her entirely, leaving her hollowed out and numb. The investigation continued, relentless in its search for answers, as though there could be any clarity in an act so deeply rooted in confusion and pain. Lily's father was questioned repeatedly, his sorrow laid bare before strangers who saw only his role as the husband, the father, the man who had been unable to see the truth hidden within his own home. They dissected his life, examined his relationships, probed into every aspect of his existence, searching for signs that might explain the tragedy that had taken root in his family. And yet, even as the investigation unfolded, even as the police gathered their evidence and pieced together the fragments of that fateful night, there was a sense of something unresolved, something that no amount of questioning or evidence could ever fully explain. The story that emerged was one of fractured identities, of secrets and silences, of a family struggling to hold itself together against the weight of unspoken truths. But it was also a story of loss, of love twisted into something unrecognizable, of a darkness that had taken root in a young girl's heart and driven her to a place she could never have imagined. In the end, the investigation would close, the police would leave, and the whispers would fade, leaving behind only the quiet, lingering echoes of a family torn apart. But for Lily, the aftermath would never truly end. The guilt, the regret, the haunting memories, these would remain with her, a constant reminder of the life she had destroyed, of the person she had become in the heat of that terrible moment. She would carry the weight of her actions with her always, a scar etched deep into her soul, a mark of the darkness that had once overtaken her and left her forever changed. For her father, the pain would linger as well, a silent wound that would never heal. He would walk through the empty halls of their home, each room a reminder of the life they had once shared, of the family he had once known. And though he would never fully understand the forces that had driven his daughter to such darkness, he would carry his own share of the sorrow, his own share of the guilt, forever questioning what he could have done differently, how he might have saved them all from the tragedy that had shattered their lives. And so in the quiet, empty house, Lily and her father remained, each lost in their own world of grief, each haunted by the shadows of a past they could never escape. The investigation, with all its probing questions and silent judgments, had come and gone, but the aftermath lingered, an invisible weight pressing down upon them, shaping their lives in ways they could never have foreseen. The secrets and silences that had once bound them had now become a gulf between them, an insurmountable chasm filled with sorrow and regret. The story that emerged from their tragedy was not one of redemption or forgiveness, but one of irreversible loss, a reminder of the fragility of family, of the dangers that lurk within the hidden depths of the human heart. And as Lily and her father moved through the days, each carrying the heavy burden of what had been lost, they understood, in their own silent, sorrowful ways, that they would never truly be free from the shadow of that terrible night. The days that followed the investigation settled over Lily's life like a shroud. Each morning she awoke to the same crushing silence, as if the air itself was weighted with an endless sorrow. What had once been a home was now a hollow shell, a place stripped of warmth, devoid of love, and filled only with echoes of a life that could never be reclaimed. The walls, once vibrant with laughter and familiar routines, now seemed to close in on her, confining her to memories she could neither escape nor fully bear. Lily felt like a ghost moving through her own existence. Her actions had severed her from the world she had known, creating a distance between her and everything she had once held dear. She was both the architect of this desolation and its prisoner, bound to the sorrow she had created, unable to seek any comfort, any forgiveness. She drifted through each day in a fog, haunted by a silence that felt more oppressive than any punishment. The choices she had made, the anger that had consumed her, the actions she had taken, all these things clung to her like a second skin, a layer of darkness she could never shed. Her father, too, was transformed by what had happened. He moved through the house with an absence in his eyes that frightened her, a vacancy that seemed to grow with each passing day. He had become a man adrift, untethered from his own life, his spirit broken in ways Lily could see but could never mend. She could sense the sorrow etched into his every step, the heavy grief that had settled upon his shoulders, aging him overnight. He was a man haunted not only by the loss of his wife, but by the realization that he could no longer recognize his daughter, the child he had once loved so fiercely. She saw in his gaze a reflection of her own torment, a quiet, unspoken anguish that bound them together, even as it tore them apart. They rarely looked each other in the eye. Every glance was a reminder of the gulf that had opened between them, an unbridgeable chasm filled with regret and unspoken questions. She could feel the weight of his sadness pressing upon her, mingling with her own, amplifying the sense of loss that had become her constant companion. The house became a place of avoidance, each of them moving silently from room to room, careful not to intrude upon the other's grief. They were trapped in their sorrow, each carrying a burden too heavy to share, too painful to confront. In the quietest moments, Lily wondered about the person she had once been. She thought of her younger self, a girl who had once held dreams, who had looked at the world with innocent eyes, unclouded by suspicion or anger. She could still remember glimpses of that life, a life defined by laughter, by love, by the warmth of family. But that girl was gone, lost beneath the weight of her own actions, buried under the choices she had made. She was no longer innocent, no longer whole. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and in doing so, she had lost a part of herself she could never regain. Lily felt the loneliness in her bones, a profound emptiness that stretched beyond words, beyond reason. The loneliness was no longer merely a lack of companionship, it was a deep-seated isolation from her own humanity, a separation from the person she had once thought herself to be. She was lost within herself, adrift in a sea of regret, haunted by the memory of what she had done and the irreparable harm it had caused. She felt as though she were fading, becoming less with each passing day, her spirit slowly eroding under the weight of her own guilt. Outside the walls of their shattered home, life continued as it always had. Neighbors went about their routines, strangers passed by without a second glance, and the world remained indifferent to her suffering, blind to the torment that consumed her. The seasons changed, the days grew shorter, colder, and yet the grief within her remained constant, unaffected by the passage of time. The pain was timeless, a wound that refused to heal, a reminder of the darkness she had allowed to take root in her heart. Her father, too, was irrevocably changed, his sorrow carving deep lines into his face, hollowing out his once strong presence. She would catch glimpses of him sometimes, sitting alone in the dim light of the living room, his gaze distant, fixed on something only he could see. In those moments she sensed his pain as if it were her own, a shared agony that bound them together, even as it pushed them further apart. They were united in their grief, yet forever separated by the choices that had led them to this place. Lily could no longer remember the warmth of her mother's embrace, or the sound of her father's laughter. Those memories had faded, blurred by the sorrow that had taken their place. Her family, once her refuge, her safe haven, had become nothing more than a distant memory, a faint echo of a life that no longer felt real. She was left with fragments, pieces of a past that no longer seemed to belong to her, images that slipped through her fingers like sand, leaving her with only the weight of her regret. In the end, Lily understood that the punishment she faced was not one of confinement or exile, but of existence itself. Her suffering was self-inflicted, a torment she carried within her, one that could never be absolved. The life she had once known was gone, and in its place was a void, a hollow space filled only with memories of what might have been. She was left to wander through her days as a shadow of herself, a reminder of the consequences of her own actions, a living testament to the destruction she had wrought. Her father, too, was a man bound to his own grief, his own guilt. Together they were two souls adrift in the ruins of a broken family, unable to bridge the gap between them, unable to find solace in each other's presence. They had become strangers, bound by blood, yet separated by the unspoken truths that lay between them, truths too painful to confront, too raw to heal. And so they lived on in silence, bound together by a shared sorrow, yet forever apart. They were a family torn apart, each of them carrying the weight of their own suffering, each of them forever marked by the choices that had led them to this place. The world outside moved on, but for Lily and her father, time had stopped, leaving them suspended in the quiet aftermath of their own tragedy, prisoners of their own making. In the end, there was no redemption, no closure, only the haunting echo of what had been lost. The story of their family was now a story of silence, of shadows, of memories that lingered like ghosts in the empty rooms of their once beloved home. And as the years passed, that silence would remain, a reminder of the darkness that had once taken root in their hearts, a testament to the fragile, irreversible nature of family love and the choices that define us.